series of AWS interview questions. In today's video, we are going to discuss a very common but deeply misunderstood AWS interview question. A question which is related to AWS Lambda and its resource access. How does Lambda function gets permission to access AWS resources like S3 bucket or DynamoDB securely? This question looks simple, but interviewers generally use this question to test your understanding of IAM, your knowledge of AWS security, and whether you have actually worked with Lambda in real world scenarios or not. Most of the candidates answer this question incorrectly. If you can explain this clearly, you will immediately stand out different in AWS and backend interview. Now, let's clearly understand the interview question. How does Lambda function get permission to access AWS resources? Our interviewer may also ask how does Lambda access S3 or DynamoDB securely? In simple words, Lambda needs to read data from S3 bucket or write into DynamoDB. How does AWS control whether this action is allowed or denied? Just think about your answer for a moment. Most of the candidates answer something like, we create an IAM user and attach it to Lambda function. We store access key in environment variables. Or they say something, Lambda automatically has the permissions. All of these answers are incorrect. The reason is, IAM users use long-term credentials. AWS services never use IAM users. Storing access key as environment variable is a security risk. This is where interviewer immediately rejects the candidate. The interviewer wants to know, do you understand the difference between IAM roles and IAM user? Do you know what Lambda execution rule is? And do you understand how AWS STS internally works? So this question is not about syntax. This question is all about AWS security design. Let's look into the core concept behind it. The difference between IAM user and IAM. An IAM user represents a human or application that needs long-term access to AWS, while an IAM role is an AWS identity that does not have long-term access, provides temporary access, and role is always assumed when it is required. Remember, AWS services should always use IAM roles, not IAM users. Now let's answer the question properly. So, AWS Lambda uses something called an execution role. An execution role is an IAM role attached to the Lambda function and defines what Lambda is allowed to do. Like whether Lambda is allowed to read data from S3 bucket, write into DynamoDB, or publish something to SNS. Important point to note here is Lambda does not store credentials. AWS automatically provides permission at the runtime. Now, what actually happens behind the scene? So, when Lambda function starts, AWS identifies the execution role. AWS internally calls STS AssumeRole. STS then provide temporary access key, temporary secret keys, temporary session token. These credentials are then injected into the Lambda environment. These credentials are automatically rotated and it expires in few minutes. Point to note here is, developers never see or manage Lambda credentials. AWS handles this securely using STS. Now, let's understand the complete flow. When Lambda function is triggered, AWS assigns the execution role for the Lambda function. Then AWS calls STS AssumeRole. STS issues temporary credentials. When Lambda function calls S3 bucket or DynamoDB, IAM evaluates the role's permission policy, whether the request is allowed or denied. In this process, everything is temporary, secure, and managed by AWS. No secrets are stored, nothing is hard-coded. Now, let's understand this using a diagram. So, we have a Lambda function which wants to access AWS resources like S3 bucket or DynamoDB. So, how Lambda function gets this access? When Lambda function is triggered, AWS assigns an execution role to the Lambda function. Using that execution role, AWS calls STS AssumeRole. STS then provides temporary credentials to the Lambda function. When Lambda function calls S3 bucket or DynamoDB, AWS evaluates roles permission policy. This is how Lambda function gets access to AWS resources. Now, let me give you the perfect interview-ready answer. AWS Lambda uses an execution rule, which is an IAM role assigned to the function. At runtime, AWS automatically assumes this role using STS and provides temporary security credentials. These credentials are used to access AWS services based on permissions defined in the roles policy. This approach avoids long-term credential sharing and follow AWS security best practices. So while answering these questions, you should always say something related to execution role and emphasize more on temporary credentials and STS AssumeRole. If you use these keywords, interviewer immediately know you understand AWS deeply. Now, let's look into the follow-up questions which are generally asked in the interview. Does Lambda store AWS credentials anywhere? The answer is no, Lambda does not store any credentials. Lambda is just an execution rule and AWS automatically assumes the role using STS at runtime. STS provides temporary credentials which are injected into the Lambda environment and rotated automatically. Now, let's look into the second question, which generally is the differentiator between the candidates. How AWS decide whether a Lambda request to S3 or DynamoDB is allowed or denied. When Lambda makes a request, AWS uses temporary credentials from the execution rule. IAM evaluates the permission policy attached to the role. AWS then check what actions are allowed on what resources and what are the conditions. If this is allowed, access is granted to AWS, and if denied, access is rejected. The point to note here is authorization is evaluated at the runtime using execution rules IAM policy. Now let's check the third question. Does Lambda call STS AssumeRole explicitly? Answer is no. This process is fully automated and managed by AWS internally. And developers do not call STS directly for the execution rule. If this video helped you, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more real-world AWS interview questions. In the next video, we will discuss another AWS interview questions which most of the backend engineers get wrong.